Some sounds can't be buried, not even under steel and chains. In a southern prison where silence was law, a white guard thought he could crush every song that dared to rise. But he forgot one thing. Faith doesn't need a microphone to be heard. A torn hymn, a man who refused to break, and a night when the whole prison sang for him. It began on a night when even the lights seemed to listen. The Louisiana Correctional Facility sat half asleep under a bruised moon, the air thick with the stale taste of bleach and rain. Somewhere deep in E Block, a single note rose, thin, trembling, human. It wasn't loud, just stubborn enough to reach the edge of the cameras. Then another voice joined, and another, until the whole block was breathing in rhythm, singing the same hymn that had once been banned. "Precious Lord, take my hand." The words crawled up the concrete and found their way into the vents, down the hall, out toward the yard where guards froze, unsure if this was mutiny or miracle. Inside the control booth, red lights flashed across the monitors. "They're singing," a young officer whispered. "All of them." His voice cracked on the last word. He'd never seen anything like it. The supervisor slammed a fist against the console. Who started it? But the screen showed only the same image on every feed. 100 cells glowing with candlelight, made from flashlights and smuggled matches, shadows moving like waves. In cell E14, a man sat motionless on the bunk, hands folded, head bowed as if listening to something only he could hear. Raymond Cole. The others called him Maestro, though the name never appeared on any official list. His eyes were closed, his fingers tapping quietly against the steel table, just enough to keep time. He didn't sing. He didn't need to. The song had already left him and found its way into the block. A guard burst into the corridor, baton in hand, shouting over the noise that wasn't really noise at all. "Lockdown! Shut it down now!" His words fell uselessly into the sea of melody. The hymn rolled through the air like smoke, slow, patient, unstoppable. Someone whispered, "They can't stop it now." From the far end of the corridor, Nurse Delilah paused with her medication cart. She should have reported the disturbance, hit the alarm, called for backup. Instead, she stood still, one hand over her chest, mouthing the same words her grandmother used to hum while shelling peas on a Sunday porch. For a second, she wasn't in a prison. She was in church again, sunlight cutting through stained glass, her mother's perfume in the air. The cameras caught everything, men swaying in unison, palms flat against the bars, some crying without shame. Even the toughest ones, lifers with scars like maps, found themselves humming before they realized it. On one monitor, Officer Whitaker stood by the door of the isolation wing, jaw clenched so tight the vein in his neck throbbed. "Cole," he muttered under his breath, "you did this." But inside that same wing, Raymond hadn't moved. His lips were still. His shoulders rose and fell in a rhythm older than words. He looked calm, but his pulse was a quiet storm under his skin. He knew what this meant. They'd come for him soon. Still, he kept time with 2 fingers on the CAO table, gentle as rain on tin. The intercom crackled, spitting static before the warden's voice came through, steady, bewildered, almost reverent. "All units, stand down, do not engage. I repeat, stand down." Then silence again. The singing filled it like water finding an empty cup. Delilah looked through the observation window and saw something she wouldn't forget. Whitaker had lowered his baton, his mouth half open, as if he'd walked into the wrong dream. Behind him, one of the rookie officers, a kid barely 20, was crying, not because of fear, but because the sound was beautiful in a way no one expected prison to be. Raymond opened his eyes. The reflection of the corridor lights glimmered in them like old film. Across the hall, a young inmate pressed his face to the bars. "They're singing for you," he said softly. Raymond shook his head. "No, son, they're singing for themselves." His voice was rough, worn thin by time and smoke, but it carried a weight that quieted the boy. The hymn reached its refrain. Through the storm, through the night, and for a heartbeat the whole facility seemed to pause, like the building itself had to breathe with them. The sound wasn't perfect. It cracked and wavered, but that made it real. It wasn't a choir of saints. It was a chorus of men who had nothing left but breath, and for once, breath was enough. Outside, The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke. Rain tapped on the roof in sync with the rhythm coming from below. The guards in the yard stood under the downpour, listening. One of them, an older man with lines cut deep into his face, took off his cap and bowed his head. "Been a long time since I heard that one," he whispered. Back inside, Whitaker finally turned toward the camera, his expression unreadable. The man who had spent months ordering silence now faced a wall of sound he couldn't command. He reached for the intercom but stopped halfway, hand trembling. The hymn swelled again, filling every inch of air. It was no longer rebellion. It was resurrection. In cell E14, Raymond let his hands fall still. The song no longer needed him to guide it. It belonged to the block now, to the broken, to the tired, to the men who had forgotten how to pray until tonight reminded them. He leaned back against the wall, listening as the last verse faded into the storm. When the final note dissolved, what remained wasn't silence. It was peace, raw and unfamiliar, the kind that sits heavy on your chest because you know it won't last forever. The intercom hummed, waiting for orders that didn't come. Somewhere, a light flickered and steadied again. A voice, maybe Whitaker's, maybe the wind, breathed through the hallway. Who started it? But everyone already knew, and somewhere deep inside that building, in the stillness after the song, a truth began to take root. You can lock a man's body, you can strip his name, you can silence his voice, but you cannot stop the echo of something born to be sung. That night, long after the floodlights dimmed and the cells went dark, the guards swore they still heard it, the faint hum of a hymn threading through the pipes, ghost-like and gentle. Maybe it was memory, maybe it was mercy. Either way, it kept time until morning. Morning in E-Block came with the sound of boots and metal, always boots first, then metal. The corridor lights flicked on like cheap miracles, cutting through the gray. Officer Whitaker walked the tier the way a man marks territory, baton resting against his thigh, thumb tapping it in rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. The sound had its own kind of authority. The inmates had learned to fall silent before he even spoke, like a dog quieting before thunder. Whitaker wasn't cruel for the sake of it. At least, that's what he told himself. Order was his creed. In another life, he'd worn a different uniform, a Marine's greens instead of prison khaki, and believed that noise was the beginning of chaos. He still carried that inside him, the idea that if he could just keep men quiet long enough, they'd forget who they were. He stopped outside cell E14. Inside, Raymond Cole sat on the bunk with his back straight and his eyes fixed on a scrap of paper. The older man's hands were steady, fingers stained with pencil lead. Whitaker didn't like that calm. Calm could be defiance in disguise. "What's that, Cole?" Raymond looked up, his tone polite, almost pastoral. "Just lyrics, sir." "Lyrics?" Whitaker stepped inside. The air smelled of soap and something older, paper, maybe hope. "This is a correctional facility, not a church picnic." Raymond folded the paper carefully, as if handling a flag. "Yes, sir." Whitaker held out his hand. "Give it here." Raymond did, wordless. The guard scanned the page. The handwriting was neat, measured, lines of an old hymn. "Precious Lord, take my hand." His jaw tightened. "You think this place needs more noise? You people can't stop singing." "It's not noise," Raymond said softly. "It's remembering." Whitaker's eyes flashed. "Remembering what? The mistakes that put you here?" Raymond said nothing. Silence was his only shield, and he'd learned to hold it better than most. That made Whitaker angrier. He tore the paper in half, then in half again, letting the pieces fall like snow. "No more of this garbage. You hum, you sing, you even breathe in time, you lose your yard privileges. Understand?" "Yes, sir." Whitaker wasn't satisfied. He bent down, ground the shreds under his boot until they were a gray smear on the floor. "Now sing, maestro," he said, voice dripping sarcasm. Raymond looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time. "Even silence keeps rhythm, sir." The room went still. Whitaker stared at him for a heartbeat too long before turning on his heel and leaving. His boots echoed down the hall, sharp and uneven. From 2 cells over, someone whispered, "Man's got a death wish." The words floated through the vents like gossip on a summer porch. When the day shift came, Raymond swept the floor of his cell, gathering the torn bits of his song and tucking them into a matchbox he'd saved. He didn't know why. Maybe habit, maybe faith. He'd written that hymn 100 times in 100 places. Some men kept pictures of their families. He kept words. They didn't age, didn't ask for forgiveness. Across the hall, a new inmate named Luis watched him. Luis was barely 20, with tattoos climbing his arms like vines and a chip on his shoulder big enough to block sunlight. "You really used to be a musician?" he asked through the bars. "I used to be a lot of things," Raymond said. "My old man said music's for people who don't know how to fight." Raymond smiled faintly. "Maybe your old man never heard a choir drown out a war." Luis didn't have an answer for that. The afternoon dragged. Heat clung to the walls. Even the guards moved slower. In the common room, the TV buzzed without sound, showing a baseball game no one cared about. Whitaker sat in the booth sipping coffee, watching the men like a shepherd counting wolves. He didn't trust the quiet that had settled since morning. Too still, too easy. When dinner was served, he made another round. He passed by Raymond's cell again, glancing in just long enough to see the older man writing on a brown napkin with a broken pencil stub. Whitaker didn't stop him this time. He wanted to see where it would go, let the old fool hang himself with his own patience. Raymond sensed the eyes on him but kept writing. He thought of his daughter, Ava, and how she used to sit in the front pew of their little church, kicking her legs and mouthing every word of every hymn. The last letter she'd sent him was tucked inside his Bible, creased, smudged, loved. "Daddy, I still hum your song before bed. Does that reach you?" He had whispered back to the paper, "Yes, baby, every night." As evening count approached, Whitaker gathered the men for inspection. He stopped by the younger officers, barking orders, keeping them alert. "These people thrive on sympathy," he said. "You start feeling sorry for them, you lose control. Control is everything." Delilah, the night nurse, stood nearby checking her clipboard. She didn't look at him when she spoke. "Sometimes control is just another kind of fear, officer." Whitaker shot her a glare sharp enough to cut. "Stick to your medicine, ma'am." She nodded, but didn't back down. "Some things don't need medicine. They just need a little grace." He didn't reply. He just turned away, his shoulders rigid, like a man trying to outrun a truth that was catching up to him. Back in E14, Raymond sat on the edge of his bunk, humming under his breath. The tune was faint, softer than the hum of the lights. The sound slipped through the bars, carried by the stale air. Across the row, Luis caught it, eyes wide. "You're going to get us both killed," he whispered. Raymond stopped, not in fear, but in pity. "You don't kill music, son. You just delay its echo." When Whitaker passed again, the humming had stopped, but something had shifted in the air, like a current moving beneath still water. He felt it, but couldn't name it. Later that night, as he wrote his report, he caught himself tapping his pen on the desk. 4 beats. Same rhythm he'd heard as a kid in church before his mother dragged him out for laughing. He shook his head, annoyed, but the pattern stayed. Tap, 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 the sound of a hymn he didn't know he remembered. Upstairs in E14, Raymond lay awake, eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling. The pieces of the hymn were still hidden under his mattress, waiting for daylight. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but he knew this much. As long as his heart kept its rhythm, the song wasn't gone. Somewhere in the dark, he heard Luis humming a single shaky note, and it made him smile. The boy didn't know the words yet, but he would. The workshop smelled of machine oil and sweat, the kind of scent that soaked into your clothes and followed you back to your cell. The men of E-Block sat in long rows, hunched over sewing machines, turning bolts of gray cloth into the same uniforms they wore. The hum of the machines was almost hypnotic until one of them stopped. It was Luis. He sat frozen, hands shaking above the fabric, his face blank. Raymond saw it before anyone else did. The boy's eyes were red, unfocused, as if staring through the wall. "What's wrong, son?" Raymond asked quietly. Luis didn't answer. He reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out a crumpled letter, and stared at it. The paper trembled in his hands. "She's gone," he whispered. The room kept moving for a second, then slowed. "My mama. They called her last night. Stroke. She didn't make it." His voice cracked into something raw and young. No one said a word. Even the guards at the far end pretended not to hear, because grief made them uncomfortable. It reminded them the men they watched were still human. Luis shoved the letter into his mouth, biting down until his teeth left marks. Then he stood, knocking over his stool. "Sit down," barked Officer Whitaker, his tone sharp and bored. "You got work to finish." But Luis didn't move. He looked like a wire about to snap. Raymond rose slowly, one hand up as if approaching a wounded animal. "Let him breathe, sir. He just got bad news." Whitaker's eyes narrowed. "You're not his chaplain, Cole. Sit your ass down." Raymond ignored him. He moved closer to Luis, close enough to see the tears cutting through the grime on the boy's cheeks. "Hey," he said softly, "look at me." Luis's breathing came in quick, uneven bursts. I can't be in here, man. Not today." "Then don't," Raymond said. He tapped the table once, twice, slow and steady. "Just follow this. In and out, that's all." Luis stared at his hand. The tap came again. Thump, thump. The boy's shoulders dropped a fraction. A few other men began to mimic it, palms tapping against the tables, benches, knees. The workshop filled with a soft, steady rhythm, a heartbeat of wood and steel. "What the hell is this?" Whitaker said, moving forward. "It's called breathing," Raymond answered without looking up. "He's about to break. I'm helping him hold." Whitaker's jaw flexed. "You're helping him disobey. Enough." He raised his baton, slamming it against the nearest table. The sound shattered the rhythm. Luis flinched like he'd been struck. Raymond turned then, his eyes calm but unyielding. "You can't stop a man from breathing, officer." "Watch me." Whitaker's voice dropped low. "You want to test me, Cole? I'm trying to keep a boy from losing himself." The guard took one step closer, boots squealing on the tile. "You want to play counselor? Do it in hell." He grabbed Raymond by the arm and yanked him away from the table. The baton swung again. Not a hard hit, just a message. "This is my block. My rules," Luis shouted. "He wasn't doing anything." Whitaker spun on him. "You keep talking, you're next." But Luis didn't back down. The boy was shaking, half from fear, half from something larger. "You don't even see us. We're people, man. We're still people." The room erupted, chairs scraping, men rising, not to fight but to stand. The guard at the door reached for his radio, fumbling. Whitaker blew his whistle, high and piercing. "Lockdown!" he yelled. "Lockdown now!" Alarms blared. The men froze, hands up. Whitaker shoved Raymond toward the exit, barking orders. "Isolation. 2 weeks. Maybe it'll teach you what silence really is." Raymond stumbled, but didn't resist. The guards cuffed him and dragged him down the corridor. The noise behind them, boots, sirens, steel doors slamming, faded as they descended into the isolation wing. In the hallway outside the workshop, Delilah stood pressed against the wall, her clipboard clutched to her chest. She had seen the whole thing through the narrow glass pane. When Whitaker passed, she tried to speak. "He wasn't starting trouble," she said. "That boy, he was calming him down." Whitaker didn't even glance at her. "You stick to bandages, nurse. I'll handle the rest." "They're men, not machines." He stopped then, turning just enough for her to see the anger in his face. "You keep talking like that, and you'll find yourself reassigned to laundry duty." When he was gone, Delilah exhaled, realizing she'd been holding her breath. Inside the workshop, the men were being herded back to their tables. Luis stood alone, the letter crushed in his hand. He looked toward the hallway, but Raymond was already gone. Down in the isolation corridor, the air was cooler, stiller. The guards opened a door and shoved Raymond inside. The room was small, square, no windows. The walls were lined with padding, soundproof. The only light came from a single bulb overhead, flickering like it was tired of its job. Whitaker stepped into the doorway. "No noise in here," he said. "No songs, no sermons, not even a hum. You understand?" Raymond nodded once. Whitaker lingered a moment longer, waiting for defiance that didn't come. "You could have made this easy," he said finally. Raymond looked up, voice steady. "Easy doesn't make men better, officer." Whitaker's face tightened, but he didn't answer. He slammed the door. The lock turned with a metallic click that echoed through the corridor. Inside, the silence was absolute. Raymond sat on the floor, back against the wall. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. Somewhere, deep inside the pipes, a faint hum of machinery vibrated through the building. He tapped a single finger against the concrete, matching the rhythm. In the workshop, above, the machines had started again. The men worked quietly, heads down, but the pattern of the needle strokes had changed, slower, steadier. Luis noticed it first. He tapped along with his foot, a small rebellion no one could punish. Across the room, others joined until the whole workshop carried a pulse like a hidden drum. Whitaker didn't notice, not yet. He was too busy writing his report about the incident. He called it a disturbance. He called it disobedience. He never once called it grief. In isolation, Raymond leaned his head back and closed his eyes. The world had gone mute, but in that silence, he could still feel the rhythm of the men upstairs, faint and faithful. The song wasn't dead. It was learning a new way to breathe. Delilah had always hated the records room. It sat behind the infirmary, a windowless space that smelled of mildew and ink, filled with rows of dusty metal cabinets no one touched unless they had to. Files went there to be forgotten, buried under years of bureaucracy and neglect. But that morning, she couldn't shake what she'd seen, the way Whitaker dragged Raymond down the hall, the sound of the door slamming behind him, the hollow quiet that followed. Something about it had scraped at her conscience all night, so when her shift ended, she found herself standing at the door to the records room, key trembling in her hand. The lock clicked open with a reluctant sigh. The fluorescent light above buzzed like a fly. She started flipping through the drawers labeled Programs Inmate Participation. The folders were thick, unevenly stacked, the paper brittle from humidity. She scanned names, numbers, dates, nothing. Another drawer, still nothing. Then, near the back, one file caught her eye. Cole, Raymond N., Authorization, Archive 2012. Her heart thumped. She pulled it out carefully. Inside were typed memos, yellowed letters, even a faded photograph. In the picture, Raymond stood in a chapel surrounded by inmates and guards alike, all mid-song. He looked younger, hair still black at the edges, arms raised like a conductor, guiding light through broken glass. The caption stamped on the back read, Therapeutic Music Initiative, Approved. There was a signature too, Warden Jessup's, and beneath it, filed by Officer Whitaker, then Sergeant. Delilah sank into the nearest chair, the weight of it hitting her like a slow tide. Whitaker had filed this. He knew. He'd known all along. She turned over the authorization letter. The ink had bled from moisture, but the words were still clear. Inmate Raymond Cole, designated as facilitator for approved music therapy program, Sundays and emergencies, per consent decree. Her fingers tightened around the paper. Somewhere upstairs, that man was sitting in a soundproof cell because another man's pride couldn't stand to hear a hymn. She heard a noise in the hallway. Footsteps. She shoved the file under her clipboard just as Whitaker appeared in the doorway. "You're early," he said, his voice carrying its usual mixture of arrogance and weariness. "Couldn't sleep," she replied. He studied her. "You got something to tell me, nurse?" "Just that you're overworking those men," she said, forcing a small smile. "Half of them should be in medical." "Half of them should be in hell," he muttered. Then his tone softened, almost human. "Don't let this place get to you. It does that. Makes people think they can save what's already gone." Delilah watched him leave before exhaling. She waited another minute, then slipped the file into her bag. Her hands shook as she zipped it closed. The next day, she found Deputy Warden Miles in his office. He was a heavy-set man with the tired kindness of someone who'd seen too much but still hoped for the best. His trumpet rested on the corner of his desk, tarnished but polished at the mouthpiece. He used to play it at memorial services. Everyone knew that. "Miles," she said quietly, closing the door behind her, "I need you to see something." He frowned as she laid the file on his desk. "Where'd you get this?" "Records. You were copied on one of the memos." He put on his glasses and read in silence. With each line, his expression changed from confusion to disbelief to anger. "This program was never discontinued," he said finally. "We just moved funding to another department. Why wasn't it on the active roster?" "Ask Officer Whitaker," she said. "He's the one who filed it." Miles looked up sharply. "He buried it?" "Seems that way." The deputy warden leaned back in his chair. "God help him," he muttered. Then he stood, taking the file with him. "I'll handle this." Back in E-Block, the men had stopped whispering. They were quieter now, not from fear, but from exhaustion. The day after the workshop incident, the entire block had been put on modified lockdown. No recreation, no music, no talking after lights out. Luis sat on his bunk, staring at the vent above his head. Every few minutes he thought he heard something, tiny taps coming from the pipes. At first, he thought he was imagining it. Then he realized it was deliberate. 1, 2, pause. 1, 2, pause, like the rhythm of a heartbeat. He pressed his palm to the wall and tapped back. After a while, the tapping stopped, replaced by a faint hum, low and steady. Luis smiled in the dark. "Still here, old man," he whispered. Whitaker, meanwhile, was in the control booth when the call came through. "Deputy Warden Miles to E-Block," the intercom announced. He frowned, setting down his coffee. It wasn't inspection day. He stepped out just as Miles and Warden Jessup entered, both men carrying folders. The entire room seemed to tilt. "Officer Whitaker," the warden said evenly, "we need to speak with you." "Sir?" Miles held up the file. "You recognize this?" Whitaker's face drained of color. "That's an old document. Obsolete." "Obsolete?" Jessup's voice was cold. "It's still signed by me, still policy, and it authorizes inmate Raymond Cole as a certified music facilitator under a consent decree you were required to enforce." Whitaker blinked. "With respect, sir, that program was suspended. By whom?" He hesitated. I don't recall." "That's convenient," Miles said, "because according to this, you not only filed it, you also removed it from the active schedule." The silence stretched until the hum of the air vents seemed deafening. Jessup's next words came slow and deliberate. "Effective immediately, Officer Whitaker, you are relieved of duty. Pending review. Hand over your keys and weapon." Whitaker's mouth opened, closed. His pride looked for a place to land and found none. Finally, he unhooked his belt, the jingle of the keys sounding louder than any alarm. He set them on the table, jaw tight. "What about Cole?" he asked quietly. Jessup turned toward the intercom. "Chaplain Ellis, bring inmate Raymond Cole to the chapel." In isolation, Raymond heard the door unlock. The light outside stabbed his eyes. Chaplain Ellis stood there, kind face lined with fatigue. "Come on, Ray," he said. "You're needed." They walked the corridor together. As they passed, the guards watched silently, uncertain whether to salute or avert their eyes. When they reached the main floor, the warden and Miles were waiting. "Mr. Cole," Jessup said, "it seems there's been a mistake. Your authorization was never rescinded. The therapeutic music program will resume immediately." Raymond nodded slowly. "Thank you, sir." His voice carried no triumph, only the gravity of something long delayed. Miles handed him the folder. "We'll need your leadership again. You think you can handle that?" Raymond smiled faintly. "Music's the one thing I never stopped handling." From behind the glass, Whitaker watched as the warden shook the inmate's hand. He felt something heavy rise in his chest, something he didn't want to name. Guilt, maybe, or recognition. He turned away before anyone could see it. In the chapel, Raymond stood at the front, looking out over rows of empty chairs. Dust motes danced in the light from the barred windows. He placed the folder on the piano, its lid still warped from years of neglect. When he pressed a single key, the note rang out pure and steady, cutting through the air like forgiveness. By evening, word had spread. Inmates whispered through vents and hallways. The old man was back. Luis grinned when he heard it, tapping the rhythm on his knee. Even those who didn't believe in God believed in that sound. And somewhere down the hall, in an office stripped of rank and noise, Whitaker sat staring at the blank wall, the hum of the building filling the quiet around him. He reached for his coffee, found it cold, and for the first time in years, didn't drink it. The song he'd tried to bury was still alive, and no report in the world could make it stop. They put Raymond back in his old cell that afternoon, the same narrow space with paint peeling like tired skin and a window too small to matter. The air was still heavy with bleach, though he swore he could smell something sweeter underneath it, dust, maybe, or the ghost of music. The guards had said nothing to him when they uncuffed his wrists. One of them, a rookie, looked almost embarrassed. The door shut with a thud that echoed like punctuation. Silence followed, deep and thick. He sat on the bunk and listened to it. For the first time in days, the quiet didn't feel like punishment. It felt expectant, like a crowd holding its breath before the curtain lifts. He reached under the mattress for the little matchbox he'd kept hidden. The scraps of his torn hymn were still there, soft and wrinkled, fragile as old skin. He unfolded them carefully, piecing the lines together as best he could. The words didn't form a complete song anymore, but maybe that was all right. Life rarely stayed in tune either. Outside, the block was restless. Word of Whitaker's suspension had spread faster than contraband. The inmates moved like a school of fish that had just realized the net was gone, unsure where to swim next. Luis stopped by Raymond's cell during cleanup duty, his broom dragging behind him. "You really going to start the music program again?" he asked. "That's the plan," Raymond said. Luis grinned. "About time. They've been waiting on you, you know." "I'm not sure they were waiting on me," Raymond replied. "Maybe they were just waiting for permission to breathe." The boy nodded, but his grin softened. "Still, you're the one who taught them how." When Luis left, Raymond looked through the bars at the corridor. Every sound, footsteps, distant laughter, the buzz of the lights, fell into a kind of rhythm. It was like the building itself was exhaling after holding its breath too long. That night, the warden authorized the first therapeutic session. It was to be held in the chapel, supervised, strictly optional. But in a place where nothing ever changed, the rumor of music moved like wildfire. By the time the hour came, the small chapel was packed, men sitting shoulder to shoulder on benches, guards lining the back wall pretending they weren't curious. The air hummed with something nervous and electric. Raymond stood at the front, his hands clasped loosely. The piano behind him had been cleaned, the dust wiped away, but the keys still yellowed with age. He touched them gently, feeling the grooves of long-forgotten fingerprints. He could almost see the faces of the men who'd played here before, some free, some not. He turned to the crowd. "We'll keep it simple," he said. His voice carried the calm authority of someone who had already lived through the worst. "You don't have to sing if you don't want to. Just breathe. That's how music starts." A few men chuckled nervously. Luis sat, in the second row, hands fidgeting, eyes wide. Raymond gave him a small nod, the kind a father gives a son before teaching him to drive. Then he pressed the first chord. It came out cracked and hesitant, like an old man trying to remember a prayer. He waited, then played again, slower this time. One voice rose from the benches, a deep, uncertain hum. Another joined it, then another. Before long, the sound grew thicker, fuller, a low river of melody winding through the air. Someone in the back began to cry, the kind of quiet crying that doesn't ask for comfort. Raymond sang the first line, his voice rough but steady. "Precious Lord, take my hand." He didn't force it. He just let the words find their own way out. The others followed, one by one, until the room swelled with harmony. Guards who had planned to watch in silence found themselves mouthing the words. Halfway through the hymn, Whitaker appeared in the doorway. He wasn't in uniform anymore, plain clothes, sleeves rolled up, eyes hollow with sleeplessness. The singing faltered for a moment when the men saw him, but Raymond didn't stop. He met Whitaker's gaze and kept playing. The officer stood there, caught between pride and something else he couldn't name. He didn't move, didn't bark orders. He just listened. When the final verse came, the sound of the men's voices filled every inch of the room, spilling into the hall, climbing the walls. It was imperfect, raw, and beautiful. Even the air vents seemed to vibrate. Luis was singing with his whole body now, hands clenched, tears streaking his cheeks. Raymond's own eyes burned, though he never broke rhythm. The song ended not with applause, but with quiet. Not the fearful kind, the peaceful kind, the kind that makes men look at each other differently. In that silence, Raymond lowered his hands. "That's enough for today," he said softly. "Let the rest of it stay in your chest." As the men filed out, they moved slower than usual, as if afraid to break whatever spell had been cast. Delilah stood near the back, her arms folded tight across her chest. When Raymond passed her, she whispered, "You changed the air in here." He smiled faintly. "Didn't change it, just reminded it what it used to be." When the chapel emptied, Whitaker was still standing by the door. He looked smaller somehow, like a man stripped of armor. Raymond walked up to him and stopped a few feet away. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, Whitaker said, You win." Raymond shook his head. It wasn't a contest. The younger man swallowed hard. "I thought noise was the enemy. Turns out it was silence." Raymond's voice softened. "Silence only hurts when it's empty. Fill it with something true, and it stops being the enemy." Whitaker nodded once, then turned and walked away. The sound of his footsteps faded, blending into the low hum still echoing in the pipes. That night, when the lights dimmed, across E Block, no one talked. They didn't need to. The air carried a faint vibration, as if the walls themselves were humming the last few notes of the hymn. Luis lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, and whispered, "He did it." In his own cell, Raymond sat on the floor, back against the wall. He wasn't praying, not exactly. He was listening to the faint music the building had learned to make on its own. The rhythm came from everywhere: the pipes, the footsteps of the night guard, the wind pressing against the bars. It was the same rhythm he'd tapped when they threw him in the dark. Only now, he wasn't the only one keeping time. When the warden did his late rounds, he stopped outside E Block, hearing something strange. It wasn't singing this time, just a low hum threading through the night, too soft to be rebellion, too beautiful to be ignored. He smiled and moved on, letting it be. And in that fragile peace, under the hum of the lights and the breath of 100 men rediscovering their voices, Raymond Cole closed his eyes and finally rested. The memo went up before breakfast, taped under glass beside the chow schedule and the list of banned items. It wasn't big, just a single sheet with the state seal at the top and words that were more weight than ink. Men clustered around it, reading out loud, reading with fingers, reading like they were checking the weather before setting out across a hard sea. Therapeutic music program, reinstated. Facilitator, inmate Raymond N. Cole. Authorized, Sundays and emergencies for de-escalation per consent decree. There were signatures at the bottom, names that had once felt as far away as the stars: Jessup, Miles, Chaplain Ellis. Someone whistled low, someone else made the sign of the cross. A lifer named Bennett laughed without humor and said, "Look at that, fellas. Paper remembers what people forget." Raymond didn't go to the bulletin board. He didn't have to. He heard it carried on every breath in the line, in the clatter of trays, in the hush that followed as the meaning sank in. He sat at a corner table with his oatmeal cooling, turning a sugar packet between his fingers as if it were a worry stone. Luis slid onto the bench across from him, eyes bright. "They put your name up," he said unnecessarily, like a boy telling his father he'd seen a rainbow. "Whole block's buzzing." Raymond nodded and slid the sugar across. "Don't choke on that," he said, the ghost of a smile in his beard. "We've got work." "What kind of work?" "The quiet kind." In the admin wing, Whitaker sat in a small room that smelled of coffee gone bitter, hands flat on a table scuffed by years of interviews. He wasn't in uniform. The absence of the belt and keys made him feel unbuttoned, like a house with the front door off the hinges. Internal Affairs had asked their questions and left him with silence. He stared at the blank wall and saw, absurdly, a church. Not the one from his childhood. He hadn't liked that place, and it hadn't much liked him, but the chapel last night where lawbreakers had sung like men who still had something to offer the world. He pressed his fingertips together until the knuckles whitened. He didn't know what to do with a world where the sound he'd tried to crush kept turning up like a song you can't get out of your head. Deputy Warden Miles found Raymond outside the chapel with a key in his palm and a trumpet case under his arm. The key he gave, the trumpet he set on the pew and opened with the care of an old habit. The brass sat there dulled, but honest. "I used to bring this out when the weather was bad," he said, almost apologizing for the memory. "Men listen different when there's a horn in the room." "They listen different when their name is spoken," Raymond said. "Music does that." Miles nodded. "Policy does it too when we let it. We're going to read the authorization over the intercom at noon. All blocks. I want there to be no confusion." "Confusion?" Raymond asked, gentle. "Or resistance?" Miles smiled with half his mouth. "You've been here long enough to know the difference is paperwork." Delilah slipped in then, holding something wrapped in a clinic towel like a fragile bone. She unrolled it on the piano, the old hymn page Raymond had been forced to surrender weeks ago, the edges bleached to a pale map of damage. She'd flattened it beneath medical texts overnight, coaxed it back to something that looked like a page. It's not pretty, she said, almost embarrassed. But it's readable. Thought you might want the truth of it with you, stain and all. Raymond traced the light scars in the paper with his thumb. The letters wavered where the bleach had burned, but the words held. Truth doesn't have to be pretty, he said. It just has to be true. At noon, the speakers coughed to life and the prison held still as the warden read. His voice came down like weather, unhurried, carrying the weight of office and something like humility. He read the dates, the decree, the authorization. He read the line that said, expression could not be suppressed absent clear and present threat. He read the name, Raymond N. Cole, clean as a bell. Every time the name fell out of the air, heads lifted. Men met each other's eyes as if to confirm that the world they inhabited could, on a Tuesday, surprise them. In the booth, a rookie folded his hands without knowing why. In the laundry, Bennett leaned back on a cart and let out a breath. In the kitchen, a man with soap up to his elbows stopped scrubbing and stared at nothing. Not everyone was pleased. On C Block, a guard named Harlan shook his head and muttered about slippery slopes. Next thing you know, they'll want guitars, he said to no one in particular. The older CO beside him, whose son had once died without a church to sing him out, said nothing and kept watching the tier with a softer gaze than usual. By afternoon, the chapel was a workshop. Raymond moved through the room, not hurrying, touching a shoulder here, correcting a posture there. You're not pushing a truck, he told one man who sang from his neck. You're letting a bird out of a cage. He stood Luis beside Bennett and told them to trade. Kid, you learn the low line. It'll keep you honest. Bennett, take the third for once and feel how it pulls. They stumbled and laughed and stumbled again, clumsy as men learning to waltz with grief. And then a phrase locked, like tumblers falling into place, and the three notes sat down together and refused to be moved. Sweat stood out on foreheads. No one cared. The room smelled like dust warmed by breath. Between songs, Raymond spoke the way he always had, plain, without sermonizing. The program says Sundays and emergencies, he said. You know what counts as an emergency? A man about to do the one thing he can't take back, a room on the edge of breaking, a grief that thinks it's alone. That's where we go. That's when we go. We don't sing to show off. We sing to hold the line. Luis raised a hand, awkward as school. What if they shut it down again? Raymond looked over at the posted memo, its corners already curling under the humidity. Paper's a door, he said. We'll keep walking through it every time someone pretends not to see it. Delilah watched from the doorway, a pen tucked behind her ear as if she might take a pulse from the music. When a man with scars running like vines down his forearms started to panic, eyes wide, breath turning to knives, she was there first, palm on his sternum, feeling for the cadence. Raymond caught her eye and nodded, falling in beside her, matching their hands like bookends. In and out, he said, and the man's chest remembered how to move. Toward evening, the chapel emptied into an echo that felt useful, like a room ready for more. Raymond stayed back to pick out a line his fingers had been chasing all day. It was a small melody, made from the spaces between a hymn's bones. He'd used it once in a hospital waiting room when a mother's hands wouldn't stop shaking. He'd used it in a field after a funeral in August when the heat made more enemies than the men ever could. He played it now for the walls, teaching them the shape of kindness. On the other side of the glass, Whitaker stood watching. A man in a suit he no longer fit. He didn't enter. He just stood with his arms crossed, face unreadable. Miles came up beside him and didn't pretend it was casual. Policy's clear, the deputy said. I heard it, Whitaker answered. I filed it once. Miles could have pressed. He didn't. Ray's got rehearsal again at 9. You should hear it from inside the room sometime. Whitaker's jaw worked. You telling me to repent, Miles? I'm telling you to listen. That night, before lights out, an announcement went block by block. Therapeutic session, emergency use approved for E-Block day room, 2100, supervision present. In cells up and down the tier, men looked at each other like someone had promised rain. They filed out quieter than usual, as if louder might make it disappear. The day room was all hard angles and scuffed tables, but under the humming fluorescence, it felt different. With Raymond standing at the far end, Luis to his left, Bennett to his right, 3 officers along the wall like punctuation marks. He lifted his hand to settle the air. You don't owe anyone pretty, he said. You owe each other true. He counted them in with 2 fingers, and the small melody from the chapel unspooled into the square room, weaving through the vents along the rails into the bones of the building. It wasn't a full hymn, just the spine. Men who didn't know words could still carry a spine. Halfway through, there was a scuffle at the far table, an argument over a debt. That would have gone bad any other night. Raymond saw it gather, saw the set of the jaw, the old hunger for heat. He cut the air with his palm and shifted the line under them, adding a low hum that sits where anger lives. "Catch it," he said, and without knowing why, they did. The argument sagged, then sat down like a tired animal. One of the officers crossed his arms and looked at the floor. By the time count rolled around, the room felt like a place you might leave without taking the worst parts of yourself back to the cell. The men drifted out with that odd reluctance you see after weddings and funerals. Luis hung back, scratching at a tattoo near his wrist. "You think this holds?" he asked. "Tomorrow, next week?" "It will if you do," Raymond said. "A building can learn a song, takes repetition." In the quiet that followed lights out, a low hum moved through E-block, not loud enough to draw a write-up, not soft enough to be mistake. It wasn't the hymn yet. It was the warm-up to a world that might allow one. In the infirmary, Delilah finished her notes and sat on the stool listening, her foot keeping time on the rung. In admin, Miles polished the trumpet mouthpiece out of habit and set it back down without playing. In the small room off the hall, Whitaker turned out his light and lay awake, the memo's words still bright on the back of his eyes, the melody threading the vents as if the place itself had decided to make room. Near midnight, rain began again, light at first, then steadier, bowing the last of summer's dust off the razor wire. Raymond lay on his back and counted the space between drops, letting them teach his breath. Somewhere down the tier, someone tapped 2 fingers against a rail. Another answered, a measure later, then another. It wasn't organized. It didn't have to be. It was a message passed hand to hand, remember. A promise made without a signature. Soon. The day started like any other. Metal doors, the smell of instant coffee, the hum of morning count. But something in the air felt different, lighter, as if the walls had decided to let their shoulders drop. Raymond could sense it before he even left his cell. It wasn't noise. It was potential, waiting to turn into sound. He pressed a hand against the concrete and felt a faint vibration under his palm, the rhythm of men alive and moving, the pulse of a place that had forgotten how to breathe until now. By mid-morning, the warden's office phone was ringing non-stop. Requests, complaints, questions about schedules and security. The memo from yesterday had traveled farther than any of them expected. Men from other wings were asking to transfer into E-block. Volunteers from the chaplain's office wanted to record the sessions for training material. Someone from the Department of Corrections had even called to clarify the boundaries of this program. The warden had answered simply, "The boundaries are where the trouble stops." When Raymond entered the chapel that afternoon, Luis was already there, sweeping the floor with exaggerated seriousness. "You'd think they were sending the governor," he joked, leaning on the broom. "Everybody's talking about tonight." "Tonight?" Raymond asked, raising an eyebrow. "They said the whole block's coming, even the guards. It's like they want to see if it's real." "It's real if we make it real," Luis grinned. "Guess that's on you, maestro." The word made Raymond laugh softly. It still sounded foreign in this place, too grand for men who wore numbers on their backs. He set down a stack of hymn sheets on the piano and began tuning what keys would still hold. Each note rang different, some sharp, some flat, but together they formed a kind of honesty that perfection never could. As evening fell, the corridors filled with a sound that wasn't quite conversation and wasn't yet music. Feet shuffling, low hums, the nervous clearing of throats. The chapel doors were propped open. Guards stood at the edges, arms crossed but eyes uncertain. Whitaker wasn't among them, but his name still hovered over the night like a question no one wanted to ask. Raymond waited until the benches were full. He looked at the men, faces hard from years of concrete and correction, eyes hungry for something that didn't come from a tray. He didn't tell them to stand. He didn't tell them to pray. He just said, "We'll start small, the way faith always does." The first chord trembled out of the piano, imperfect but clear. Luis joined with a hum, his voice deepening as others found their way in. A dozen, then 50, then more. The sound grew until it rolled through the chapel, down the corridor, past the guards who stopped pretending not to listen. From somewhere in the back, Bennett started to cry. He tried to hide it at first, wiping his face with his sleeve, but the sound came out anyway, a low, broken sob that pulled something loose in the room. The melody wavered for a second, then grew stronger, wrapping around him like cloth. Raymond didn't look up from the keys. He didn't have to. He could feel the shift, the moment when the song stopped belonging to him and became theirs. In the control booth above, an officer flipped on the hallway speakers by accident, or maybe on purpose. The hymn spilled through the intercom into every corner of E-Block. Men in their cells lifted their heads. A few laughed, unsure if it was allowed. Then one began to sing along, then another. Downstairs, Whitaker stood outside the chapel, frozen. He had come without meaning to. The sound found him in the hallway and rooted him there. He could see through the narrow window in the door, Raymond at the piano, Luis leading a line of voices, the guards no longer guarding but simply watching. For a long moment, he stayed where he was, hand resting on the doorknob, not opening it, not walking away. The hymn swelled. Through the storm, through the night, lead me on to the light. The words weren't just sung, they were claimed. Even the men who didn't know the verses mouthed the rhythm, catching the rise and fall like a tide. Whitaker finally pushed the door open. The hinges groaned, but no one turned to look at him. He stepped inside slowly, almost shyly, as if trespassing in a world he'd once tried to bury. The sound hit him like warm air after winter. His throat tightened. He didn't sing, he couldn't, but he stood in the back, head bowed, hands clenched and unclenched as though trying to find something to hold. When the final chord came, it hung in the air longer than seemed possible, carried by the echoes in the rafters. Then it faded, leaving only breathing, the steady, shared kind that fills a room with peace. For a moment, no one moved. Then Luis laughed, short and disbelieving. "We did it," he said. "We really did it." Raymond turned toward him, eyes glistening. "You did it," he said. "All of you." Bennett wiped his face. "Feels like something's been fixed." "Maybe not fixed," Raymond replied. "Maybe just heard." The men began to drift out, slower than they came in. Guards nodded at them, not as officers, but as witnesses. When the chapel finally emptied, Whitaker remained, standing near the door. Raymond was closing the piano lid when he noticed him. Their eyes met, the kind of meeting that doesn't need words to know what it's about. Whitaker stepped forward, his voice low. "You kept your promise. I only promised to try." Whitaker nodded. His jaw worked like he was chewing on something unsaid. "I thought I understood what power was," he said finally. "Turns out it sounds like this." Raymond studied him for a long moment. "Then don't forget it," he said. Whitaker exhaled through his nose, almost a laugh, almost a prayer. "Guess I won't." When he left, Raymond sat back down at the piano. The room was still humming with the ghost of the song. He pressed one key just to hear the echo answer. It did, faint but faithful. Up in the tower, the night guard leaned against the window, looking over the yard. The floodlights cast pale halos on the wet ground, and somewhere in the distance, a voice, maybe two, started humming again. Soon it was more. A ripple spreading from cell to cell, a quiet wave of sound threading through concrete and steel. By the time the lights dimmed for curfew, the entire prison was humming. Not loud, not in defiance, just steady, like the heartbeat of something newly alive. The officers in the booth didn't stop it. They didn't even try. One of them turned down the radio and said softly, "Let him have it." Raymond leaned his head against the piano and closed his eyes. The building vibrated around him, a chorus made of breath and memory. He smiled, small and tired, and whispered to no one, "Now it's real." Outside, thunder rolled somewhere far off, a reminder of storms that would come again. But for that night, the walls had learned harmony, and even the silence afterward felt holy. Morning crept in slow, the kind of soft gray light that comes after a hard rain and makes the world feel washed but not new. The air smelled faintly of bleach, coffee, and damp concrete, the familiar perfume of a place that forgot what fresh meant a long time ago. The guards moved quieter than usual, like men still carrying the echo of something holy from the night before. In E Block, the humming had faded with the dawn, but the silence that replaced it wasn't the same one they'd known for years. It had shape now, gentle, settled, earned. Raymond woke early, sitting on the edge of his bunk. His hands rested on his knees, fingers twitching faintly, conducting a song only he could hear. His voice was rough from age and nights of dust, but it didn't matter. He could still feel the rhythm in his chest, steady as a heartbeat. The pipes along the ceiling pinged with heat. Someone 2 cells over coughed, then chuckled, a sound that carried something human in it. He smiled without realizing. A guard stopped outside his door. It wasn't Whitaker. He hadn't seen him since the chapel, but a younger one, clean-shaven and uncertain. "You got visitors, Cole," the guard said, almost polite. Raymond rose slowly. "This early?" "Deputy Warden and the nurse. Said it won't take long." They walked him through the corridor, where the light pooled gold against the concrete. The place looked different to him now, as if the walls themselves had relaxed their grip. The day room still bore traces of last night's gathering, a scuff of shoe polish where men had tapped their feet, a bent spoon left like an offering. When they reached the infirmary, Miles and Delilah were waiting. Miles had his trumpet case under one arm. "Morning, Ray," he said. "Thought you'd want to hear the news before rumor mangled it." Delilah smiled, weary but warm. "They're calling it the E Block Chorus," she said. "Word's gone around the whole state system. Apparently morale metrics jumped overnight. The warden says it's in the official report." Raymond chuckled softly. Imagine that. Paperwork for peace. Miles opened the trumpet case. Inside wasn't just the instrument, but a stack of new hymn sheets, freshly printed. "We're expanding the program," he said. "They want you to train facilitators from the other units. Maybe even record some sessions. Guess they figured out music costs less than riot gear." Raymond ran a hand over the paper, feeling the smoothness of ink and possibility. "That's good," he said quietly. "Long as it stays honest." "It will," Delilah said. "Not everyone liked it, but no one's forgetting it." She hesitated, then added, "Whitaker put in for transfer last night. Didn't say where. Left a note on your file." Raymond looked up. "A note?" She handed him a folded scrap, creased but clean. 2 words written in a careful hand. "Thank you." He stared at it for a long moment, before folding it again, slower this time, tucking it into his shirt pocket like something fragile. "Guess some songs take longer to learn," he said. Miles lifted the trumpet and blew a single clear note into the air. It wasn't loud, just enough to fill the room and remind them all what breath could do when it wasn't spent on orders or excuses. Raymond nodded toward it. "Keep that one. It's a good key." After they left, he walked back to his cell unescorted. The younger guard stayed a few steps behind but didn't rush him. Halfway down the hall, Luis was leaning against the bars of his own cell, eyes still swollen from sleep. "Heard they're sending you around the prison," he said, "teaching others to do what you do." "I don't teach singing," Raymond said. "I just remind people they already knew how." Luis grinned. "You ever think about what you'll do when you get out?" Raymond paused. "Haven't thought that far ahead." "You should. Somebody like you doesn't stay locked up forever." "Somebody like me." "The kind that makes the guards listen." Raymond laughed softly. "We'll see about that." He looked down the corridor where the light from the end of the hall painted a pale stripe across the floor. "For now, this'll do." Later that day, he found himself alone in the chapel. The benches were empty, but the air still carried the faint echo of voices. His, theirs, all tangled together into something that refused to fade. He sat at the piano and touched the keys. A few responded with clean tone, others with dull thuds, but even the broken ones had their own truth. He began to play, not the hymn they'd sung last night, but something smaller, simpler, a tune he used to hum to Ava when she couldn't sleep. His fingers moved slow, tender, patient. The door creaked open behind him. Delilah leaned against the frame, arms crossed. "Didn't think you'd be here this early." "Didn't think I'd ever leave," he said. "Old habits die last." She smiled. "Keep playing. The sound carries down to medical, makes the day less heavy." He played until she left, until the sound bled into the hum of the building. Somewhere above, a bell clanged for shift change. He stopped, letting the last note linger until it disappeared into the air. The silence that followed felt right, full, not empty. By evening, the sky outside the narrow windows turned the color of copper. In the yard, men walked slow laps, some talking, some quiet. No one shouted. A bird landed on the fence line, indifferent to the wires, then took off again. Luis passed Raymond near the laundry gate, nodding toward the open sky. "Think they hear us out there?" he asked. "Maybe," Raymond said. "Maybe they don't need to." That night after count, the lights dimmed early. Rain began again, tapping a lazy rhythm on the roof. The air smelled clean, almost kind. Raymond lay on his bunk, eyes half closed, listening to the drops find their own percussion against the metal. Across the block, someone started to hum. The melody was familiar, but softer, changed slightly by distance. Another voice joined, and another, until the sound rolled gently through the corridor. He didn't join in this time. He just listened. Every voice carried its own tremor, its own prayer, and somewhere inside that imperfect harmony was the proof that all the beating, all the silence, all the waiting had meant something. He closed his eyes and let it surround him. If a man learns anything in a place like this, it's that justice doesn't come crashing down. It drips slow, steady, like water wearing its stone. Respect isn't shouted into existence. It's built one quiet act at a time, the way light learns to sneak through bars. When the voices faded, Raymond whispered to the dark, "That'll do." The building exhaled with him. The pipes ticked as they cooled, the rain kept time, and for a long, unbroken moment, the prison sounded less like a cage and more like a choir breathing in its sleep.